The alien princess saw me, told her friends this is my husband, and smiled. Jackson Carter had always thought of himself as an ordinary man. A researcher working in a quiet lab in a small city, he had little time for grand dreams or adventures. He was content with his work, his books, and the occasional quiet evening in front of the TV. But everything changed one evening as he sat late at his desk, reviewing the results of his latest experiment. It started with a strange hum in the air, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, he thought it was just a malfunction in the lab's equipment, but the sound grew louder and the lights flickered above him. His eyes widened as the room filled with an unearthly glow. Panic set in, but Jackson couldn't tear his eyes away. A swirling vortex of light began to form in the center of the room, and before he could react, he felt himself pulled into it. The next thing Jackson knew, he was no longer in his lab. The walls, once white and sterile, were replaced by towering structures that seemed to touch the sky. Alien technology buzzed around him, floating platforms, strange vehicles, and beings of all shapes and sizes. He stumbled backward, feeling the ground beneath him shift as if the very fabric of reality had changed. Jackson stood in the middle of what looked like an alien city, filled with bright colors, unfamiliar sounds, and a sense of awe. He could hear the chatter of beings speaking in languages he couldn't understand. A mix of excitement and fear flooded him as he realized what had happened. He was no longer on Earth. He tried to move, but his legs felt weak beneath him. He was surrounded by creatures with blue skin, some with 4 arms, others with large, shining eyes. He had no idea where he was or how to get back home. Panic set in again as he realized he didn't know how to even communicate with them. Before he could gather his thoughts, a voice broke through the chaos. "Look at him," a woman said, her tone filled with curiosity. Jackson turned to see a figure approaching him, a woman, though she wasn't quite like any human he had ever seen. She had pale purple skin, glowing eyes, and long silver hair that cascaded down her back. She walked with grace, her presence commanding attention. "Who is he?" someone asked from behind her, but Jackson couldn't make out the words. The woman smiled warmly at him. "This is my husband," she said simply, turning to her companions. She spoke as if the statement were perfectly normal. Jackson's mouth went dry. "What?" he managed to say. "Husband? No, I'm not," but the woman wasn't listening. She seemed unfazed by his confusion. "Yes," she said with a soft laugh. "This is my husband. He's come from Earth." Jackson blinked, his heart racing. This was not how he had imagined meeting extraterrestrials. In fact, he hadn't imagined meeting them at all. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The woman gestured toward her companions, who were eyeing him curiously. "Let's take him to the palace. He's important." "Wait, hold on," Jackson stammered. "I don't know what you mean. I'm not your husband. I'm just a scientist. I don't even know how I got here." But it was too late. She had already taken his arm and was leading him through the crowd. He tried to pull away, but her grip was surprisingly strong, and before he could protest further, they were moving through the streets of the alien city. As they walked, Jackson's mind raced. What kind of place was this? Where was he? Was he dreaming? No, this was too real to be a dream. He could smell the strange alien spices in the air, hear the sounds of odd machinery and distant chatter. Eventually, they reached a massive building that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. A grand palace with tall spires, shining glass walls, and energy fields surrounding it. Guards stood at attention as they approached, and the woman, the alien princess, he now realized, walked confidently inside. Jackson was led into a grand hall. His eyes widened as he took in the alien architecture, the gleaming surfaces, and the high ceilings that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. This was nothing like Earth. It was a world completely foreign to him. "Please sit," the princess said, gesturing toward a luxurious chair. She smiled at him again, her violet eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite place. "We'll have you comfortable soon." Still dazed, Jackson slowly sat down, trying to make sense of everything. He was trapped in a strange world with an alien princess who had just called him her husband. He had no idea how to get home, or if he even could. His mind raced with questions, but all he could do was watch as the princess settled beside him. "Now," she said, her tone lighter than before, "we'll discuss the matters of the kingdom." Jackson stared at her, still unsure whether this was a dream or some bizarre twist of fate. "The kingdom?" he repeated. "Yes," the princess replied, "my kingdom. And you, my husband, will help me protect it." Jackson shook his head, trying to process her words. I'm not your husband, he protested weakly, but the princess only smiled again as if he had said something amusing. You will be, she said softly, leaning in slightly. In time you will understand, but for now just know that you are important to me, to us. Jackson wanted to argue, to demand answers, but as he looked into her eyes, something about her presence made him hesitate. There was a confidence in her gaze, a strength that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe he didn't fully understand what was happening, but in that moment, Jackson realized that his life was no longer simple. He had just stepped into a world of power, politics, and destiny, and somehow he had been placed at the heart of it all. Jackson sat in the lavish chair, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. The princess, Lyra, as she had introduced herself, smiled gently, her eyes shimmering with an intensity he couldn't fully grasp. He had no idea how to respond to her claim that he was her husband. He had barely spoken 2 words to her, let alone formed any sort of relationship with her. Yet, there was something about the way she spoke that left him feeling uncertain, like he was meant to be here, meant to play a part in some bigger plan. The entire palace around him was a blur of sleek, futuristic design, and its inhabitants, mostly humanoid with striking features, moved around with purpose, going about their business. He was the only one out of place. "Do you feel comfortable, Jackson?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but carried an undeniable authority. She didn't seem to expect an answer. "We have much to discuss." Jackson swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "I don't know what's going on," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "You just pulled me from my world and brought me here, and now you're calling me your husband. That doesn't make any sense." Lyra's smile softened. "It may seem strange now, but it will all make sense in time. My world, our world, Jackson, is very different from Earth. There are customs, expectations, and things that cannot be explained immediately." She tilted her head, her long silver hair swaying. "But I promise you will understand. You have been chosen." Jackson's mind raced. "Chosen for what?" He leaned forward, his frustration growing. "I don't belong here. I'm just a guy from a quiet little lab. I have nothing to do with any of this." Lyra remained calm. "Your presence here is not an accident, Jackson. You were brought here for a reason. The universe has a way of connecting us all, and sometimes it requires an unexpected bond." She paused for a moment before adding, "And yes, you are my husband. In time, you will come to understand why." Jackson felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He could see that Lyra wasn't playing some sort of game. There was something in her eyes that spoke of honesty and deep conviction. But still, it didn't make sense. He had so many questions, but before he could ask another one, the doors to the hall opened and a group of alien soldiers entered, their armored suits gleaming. "Princess," one of the soldiers said, bowing deeply, "we've secured the perimeter. There is no sign of Lord Thallo's forces yet, but we are ready." Lyra stood with a grace that was almost otherworldly, her eyes scanning the soldiers briefly. "Good," she replied simply, but there was a sharp edge to her voice. She turned back to Jackson. "I must attend to matters of my kingdom. You are safe here, but you must understand that our enemies are powerful. We have been at war for years." "War?" Jackson repeated, bewildered. "What do you mean, war?" Lyra stepped closer, her voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "I am the heir to this kingdom. My family has ruled for generations, but there are factions, rival houses, who seek to take my throne. Lord Thallos is one of them. He is my cousin, and he has the power to challenge me for leadership. I am not merely a princess. I am the rightful ruler of this land, but my claim is threatened and I need help to protect it." Jackson blinked. "And you think I'm the one to help you?" Lyra's gaze was unwavering. "Yes, you were brought here for a reason, Jackson. My people have their traditions, their warriors, their strategies, but they have never encountered someone like you. Your intelligence, your ways of thinking, they are what we need. You will help us win this war." Jackson felt like the world was spinning. "I don't know the first thing about intergalactic warfare. I'm just a researcher." Lyra smiled again, a soft, knowing smile. "That is why you are important. The universe does not place us where we belong by accident. You may not understand yet, but I need you. And whether you know it or not, you need me too." The words left him reeling. Before he could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, followed by a voice that made Jackson's heart race. "Princess Lyra," a man's voice called out, his tone respectful but firm. A tall figure entered, his dark armor glinting in the light. He had sharp, angular features and piercing eyes that looked directly at Jackson. "I trust you are well?" Lyra turned to face the newcomer, her demeanor changing instantly. "Yes, Commander Ralax, I am well. We are preparing for the worst, as I'm sure you are aware." Ralax's gaze shifted to Jackson, scrutinizing him for a moment before he spoke again. "The human?" He didn't sound impressed. "Forgive me, Princess, but I fail to see how this human will be of any use to us." "He's an outsider, he knows nothing of our ways." Jackson bristled, but Lyra was quick to respond, her tone commanding. "You are wrong, Commander. He will be an asset. In time you will see." She turned to Jackson then. "I need you to trust me, Jackson, please. This war, this kingdom, it is all at stake." Ralax seemed ready to protest further, but Lyra held up a hand, silencing him. "This is not up for debate. Jackson will stay and he will help us. I will not be swayed on this matter." The commander bowed his head in deference, though the look of skepticism never left his face. "As you wish, Princess. We will continue preparations, but I urge caution. This human may not be the solution we seek." Jackson felt a rush of emotions, fear, confusion, but also something else. Despite the skepticism of the soldiers, despite his own disbelief, something in Lyra's presence made him want to help. She wasn't asking for him to be her husband for any selfish reason. She was asking for his help for the survival of her people. "I don't know what I can do," Jackson said quietly, his voice almost lost in the room. "But I'll try. I'll help however I can." Lyra's eyes softened. "That is all I ask, Jackson. Your willingness to stand with me will make all the difference." She turned away then, heading toward a set of double doors at the far end of the room. "Follow me," she said, motioning for him to come along. "It's time to prepare for what comes next." Reluctantly, Jackson stood up, his body still heavy with uncertainty. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was clear. His life had changed forever. And as much as he wanted to go back to his simple life, he realized that there was no going back now. He had been thrust into a war he didn't understand, with a woman he had only just met but somehow felt connected to. And so Jackson Carter, ordinary scientist from Earth, followed the alien princess into the unknown, unsure of what awaited him but certain that nothing would ever be the same again. Jackson followed Princess Lyra through the gleaming halls of the palace, trying to steady his thoughts. Everything felt unreal. He was in a completely different world, surrounded by alien technology and beings that looked both familiar and utterly strange. His mind raced, trying to process everything she had said. Lyra, the alien princess, had called him her husband. But what did that even mean? How could someone like him, a simple researcher from Earth, be of any use in a war? Lyra led him into a large chamber, its walls lined with shimmering screens that flickered with complex symbols and data. There were no windows, but the room was bright, filled with light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She moved with a quiet grace, her silver hair flowing behind her as she approached a large table in the center of the room. "Sit," Lyra said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. She stood by the table, her fingers lightly brushing the surface. Jackson hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He could see maps and blueprints spread out before her, images of what appeared to be battle plans. "What is all this?" Jackson asked, looking at the intricate designs and symbols that covered the screens and holographic maps. "These are the plans for our defense," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "Lord Thalos is preparing for an all-out assault. His forces are vast and he is ruthless. If we do not act quickly, we will lose everything." Jackson swallowed hard, looking at the maps. It was difficult to understand what he was seeing, but one thing was clear. The stakes were high. This wasn't just a battle, it was a fight for survival. For a moment, the enormity of the situation hit him. He wasn't just some confused stranger in an alien world. He was part of something much bigger than himself. "You said I could help," he said quietly. "How?" "I'm not a soldier. I don't know anything about war." Lyra turned to face him, her expression soft but intense. "You may not be a soldier, Jackson, but you have something that we need, an outsider's perspective. Our people are warriors, but they have been fighting the same way for centuries. They are set in their ways, and that is why they are losing. You think differently. You can bring fresh ideas, strategies that we would never consider." Jackson opened his mouth to protest, but Lyra held up a hand. "I know it's difficult to understand. I don't expect you to be a hero overnight. But you have something that can help us, something that we've never had before, an outside view, a mind that doesn't think like ours." For a moment, Jackson sat in stunned silence. His mind raced. He wasn't a strategist, not even close. But what if Lyra was right? What if he could help them think outside the box? He didn't know how, but something deep inside told him that he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice firm despite the uncertainty in his chest. "I'll help however I can." Lyra smiled, her eyes warm. "Thank you, Jackson. You don't know how much this means to me." Before Jackson could respond, the doors to the chamber opened with a soft hiss, and Commander Ralax stepped in. His stern expression softened when he saw Jackson, though he clearly still didn't trust him. The commander was tall and imposing, his dark armor reflecting the soft glow of the room's lights. "Princess," Ralax said, his voice respectful but filled with authority, "the situation is growing worse. Thalos' forces are massing near the eastern border. We need to make a decision quickly. We cannot wait much longer." Lyra stood, her posture straight and commanding. "I understand, Commander. I will be there shortly." She turned back to Jackson. "This is Commander Ralax, my most trusted advisor. He leads our forces in battle." Ralax's gaze shifted to Jackson, sizing him up once again. "So this is the human," he muttered, his tone less than friendly. "I still don't understand how he can help." "I've told you, Commander," Lyra said firmly. "Jackson will be an asset. He will help us. You will see." Ralax nodded reluctantly but said nothing further. He turned and left the room without another word. Jackson watched him go, feeling the weight of the commander's skepticism. It was clear that Ralax didn't believe in him, didn't believe that he could contribute to the war. But Jackson had made a decision. He had to try. He couldn't just stand by and let people fight without doing something to help. Lyra turned back to Jackson, her expression softening. "Do you see now? The war is coming and we must prepare. I can't do this alone. You may not believe it now, but you are an important part of this." Jackson nodded, his mind still swirling. He wasn't a hero, but for the first time since he had arrived in this strange world, he felt something other than fear. He felt a sense of purpose, a desire to help Lyra and her people, even if he didn't understand everything yet. "I'll help you," he said again, more confidently this time. Lyra smiled, and Jackson couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. "Thank you, Jackson. Now let's get to work." The princess moved to one of the holographic screens, tapping it lightly. The image shifted, revealing a 3D map of the kingdom with highlighted areas showing troop movements and strategic points of interest. Lyra began explaining the layout of the kingdom and where the enemy forces were likely to strike. Jackson listened carefully, trying to understand the terrain and how he could contribute. They worked together for hours, discussing strategies and counterattacks. Jackson's ideas were simple, using guerrilla tactics, setting traps, and creating diversions. It wasn't complicated, but it was effective. Lyra listened intently, asking questions, her mind clearly working through every possibility. Slowly, Jackson started to feel like he was part of something important. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was part of their fight. As the day wore on, Jackson grew more confident in his ability to help. The alien world, once so intimidating, was starting to feel a little less foreign. He still didn't fully understand the politics, the customs, or the gravity of the situation. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't leave, not when they needed him. Finally, as the evening approached, Lyra turned to him with a serious expression. "Jackson, we must prepare for battle. Tomorrow we will take action. I need you to be ready." Jackson nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm ready." As he stood and followed her out of the chamber, the weight of what he had agreed to truly sank in. Tomorrow they would face Thalos and his army. It wasn't just a battle for Lyra's throne. It was a battle for the future of the kingdom, for the survival of everything they had fought for. And somehow, Jackson knew that this was only the beginning. The morning came faster than Jackson expected. He had spent the night in a room that was far more luxurious than anything he had ever seen back on Earth. The bed was soft, almost too soft, and the air in the room felt cool and strange, like the very atmosphere was different from what he was used to. But sleep had been hard to come by. His mind was racing with thoughts of the battle to come, of the strange world he had been thrown into, and the impossible role he was supposed to play. As he dressed in the clothing Lyra's people had provided, light armor that looked both functional and ceremonial, he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. He was a researcher, not a soldier. But Lyra's words echoed in his mind. "You are important to me, Jackson, to us." When he entered the main hall, Lyra was already there, standing beside a table covered in maps and tactical data. She looked as regal as ever, her silver hair cascading down her back, her purple skin glowing under the soft light. She didn't look nervous. In fact, she looked determined, confident even, but Jackson could see the weariness in her eyes, the strain of carrying the weight of her people on her shoulders. "Good morning, Jackson," she said, her voice steady as she motioned for him to join her. "Are you ready?" Jackson nodded, though he wasn't sure if he truly was. How could he be? He had no experience with war, no experience with leadership. But he wasn't about to back down now. The stakes were too high, and Lyra was counting on him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. Lyra smiled, a small, reassuring smile that did nothing to ease the knot in Jackson's stomach. "Good. We've prepared as much as we can. Now we wait." The room was filled with a tense silence as the hours passed. Jackson tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting. He thought about his life back on Earth, how simple and predictable it had been. There had been no danger, no urgent decisions, no life-or-death consequences. And now, here he was, standing at the edge of a war, surrounded by beings whose lives depended on his ideas, his strategies. He had no idea how this had all happened, but the reality was clear. He couldn't turn back now. At noon, the first signs of battle came. The distant rumble of explosions echoed through the air, followed by the sharp crackle of gunfire. Jackson could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of the coming conflict. Lyra was already on her feet, directing her forces with a calm authority that Jackson admired. She wasn't just a princess. She was a leader, and she wore the mantle of leadership with grace. The holographic maps in the room shifted as Ralax entered, his face grim. "Princess," he said, his tone urgent. "Thalos's forces are approaching. They've breached the outer defenses. We must move quickly." Lyra didn't hesitate. "Prepare the forces. Jackson, it's time." Jackson's heart raced as he followed Lyra and Ralax out of the room. The air outside was thick with smoke, and the sounds of battle grew louder with each step. Soldiers, both alien and human, moved quickly around them, preparing for the coming fight. There were no speeches, no grand declarations. Everyone was focused on the task at hand, survival. Lyra led him to a command center where several generals were already waiting, their faces tense. "Jackson," she said, her voice low, "this is where your ideas will matter. We've set traps, created distractions, and prepared as much as we can. But we need you to help us anticipate Thalos's next move. His army is large, but they are not as organized as ours. They rely on brute force. We must outsmart them." Jackson nodded, swallowing his fear. "What can I do?" Lyra turned to one of the generals, a tall alien with sharp features. "General Laria, show Jackson the Eastern Front. The traps we've set should slow them down, but we need to move our forces into position before they break through." Laria nodded and gestured for Jackson to follow. As they moved through the battlefield, Jackson saw the alien soldiers preparing their weapons, checking their gear, and taking their positions. It was all so different from what he had imagined a battlefield would look like. There were no grand armies, no sweeping formations. Instead, it was a web of small skirmishes, individual units working together to hold their ground. Jackson's eyes scanned the area as they approached the Eastern Front. The enemy forces were closer now, their hulking figures moving through the smoke. They were massive, a mix of alien creatures with thick armor and weapons that crackled with energy. Jackson could see that they were organized, but they were also reckless. They charged forward without thinking, without strategy. "This is what we need to exploit," Laria said, pointing toward the advancing enemy. "They will rush in, expecting to overwhelm us, but they won't expect us to be prepared." Jackson looked around, his mind racing. He saw several structures nearby, large enough to provide cover, and he quickly formulated a plan. "We can use the buildings to our advantage," he said, turning to Laria. "Set up snipers on the rooftops, create a kill zone. The enemy will charge, but they won't know where the fire is coming from. We can funnel them into a narrow space and pick them off one by one." Laria's eyes narrowed, clearly considering the idea. "It could work, but we will need to move fast. Once they breach the perimeter, we won't have time to set up." "I know," Jackson said. "We need to be ready now." He quickly made adjustments to the plan, coordinating with the generals and soldiers to position them for maximum effect. He wasn't a military strategist, but the logic of it was simple. Thalos's forces were powerful, but they lacked the precision and tactics that could give them an advantage. As they finished setting up, the sounds of the battle grew louder, the ground shaking with the force of explosions. Jackson's heart raced, his mind focused only on the task at hand. He could feel the weight of Lyra's trust on his shoulders, and he knew that failure wasn't an option. Then, the first wave of Thalos's forces charged. They were fast, but they were unprepared for the trap that Jackson and the generals had set. As they moved into the narrow kill zone, the soldiers on the rooftops opened fire, picking off the enemy one by one. The chaos that followed was like nothing Jackson had ever seen. There was no order, no discipline in the way the enemy soldiers fought. They were caught in the crossfire, disoriented and vulnerable. Jackson watched, a mix of awe and fear gripping him as the battle unfolded before his eyes. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of this. The traps, the strategies, they were his ideas and they were working. But it wasn't over. Thalos's forces were relentless. They regrouped, pushing forward with more intensity. Jackson felt a surge of adrenaline as he watched the enemy advance. This was it, the fight for survival. Lyra's voice came through his earpiece, calm and clear. "Jackson, we need to move to the next phase, prepare the reinforcements. We can't let them break through." He nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. The war wasn't won yet, but they had taken the first step. Jackson Carter, the ordinary man from Earth, was no longer an outsider. He was a part of this world now, and he would fight alongside Lyra and her people to ensure their survival. The battle raged on for hours. Jackson could feel the tension in the air, the sense of urgency that weighed on every decision. The explosions, the sounds of blaster fire, and the shouts of soldiers filled the atmosphere, but amidst the chaos, there was a strange sense of focus. Lyra's forces were holding their ground, but Thalos's army was relentless, pushing forward, each wave more determined than the last. Jackson had never seen anything like it. Back on Earth, he had always been a man of logic, of calculations, of quiet observation. But here, in this alien world, everything was different. His strategies, simple though they were making a difference. He had helped turn the tide of the battle, guiding Lyra's forces through the chaos with his unconventional ideas. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. His mind raced as he moved from one part of the battlefield to another, coordinating with soldiers and officers, making sure the traps were set. The fire lines were strong, and the enemy was being pushed back. He was no longer just a researcher. He was a leader in his own right, albeit an unwilling one. As the day wore on, the enemy's attacks slowed. Their advance had been stopped, at least for now. The battlefield was littered with debris, and the air was thick with smoke. Jackson's heart pounded as he moved toward Lyra's command center, his legs aching from hours of constant movement. When he entered, Lyra was already there, surrounded by her generals and officers, her expression unreadable as she watched the holographic displays. Ralex was standing by her side, his face grim but with a touch of respect in his eyes as he glanced at Jackson. "Princess," one of the officers said, "we've pushed them back, but they're regrouping. We can't hold them off much longer without reinforcements." Lyra nodded, her expression hardening. "Then we will give them no time to breathe." She turned to Jackson. "We need your help again. The enemy will likely launch another wave before nightfall. We must counter them before they have a chance to organize." Jackson stepped forward, his thoughts sharp despite the exhaustion pulling at him. "We've already worn them down a bit. If we can create another distraction, maybe hit them where they're weakest, we can force them into retreat." Lyra raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his suggestion. "Tell me more." Jackson quickly formulated his plan. "Their supply lines are vulnerable. If we can cut them off, maybe sabotage their communication and food supply, we can starve them of the resources they need to keep fighting. We won't be able to take them all down at once, but we can cripple them enough to create confusion." Lyra's eyes lit up with approval. "It's risky, but it could work. Commander Ralex, make the necessary preparations. Jackson, we move within the hour." Ralex didn't hesitate. "As you command, Princess," he nodded at Jackson. "You may have just given us a way to win this." Jackson felt a rush of adrenaline. It was strange being part of this world, part of this war. But as Lyra's forces moved to carry out the plan, Jackson knew this was the moment that could decide everything. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was here for a reason, and he would do whatever it took to help them win. The next few hours passed in a blur of movement and tension. Jackson, along with a small team of soldiers, moved under the cover of darkness, slipping into enemy territory to disable their supply lines. The mission was dangerous and the stakes were high, but Jackson's mind remained focused. He wasn't just fighting for Lyra's kingdom. He was fighting for their future, for the survival of a people he had come to respect. As the team approached the enemy's main storage facility, the sounds of battle were distant but still constant. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest as they crept through the shadows, moving quickly and quietly. The enemy soldiers were nearby and they couldn't afford to be spotted. Jackson's breathing was steady, his mind calm despite the danger. This was where his skills as a researcher, his ability to think critically under pressure, came into play. They reached the facility's entrance, and Jackson quickly got to work, using the tools provided to him by Lyra's people to disable the security systems. It wasn't easy, but after what felt like an eternity, the entrance was open. The team moved inside, setting explosives on key structures, the communication hub, the food supplies, and the fuel tanks. Jackson's hands shook slightly as he set the final charge, but he remained calm. There was no room for fear. He glanced at his team, nodding at them to move out. They quickly retreated, using the shadows to cover their escape. Back at the command center, Lyra and her generals were awaiting the news. The plan had to succeed, and Jackson knew it had to happen fast. The moment the explosions went off, the enemy would be thrown into chaos. The key now was timing. A few minutes later, the ground shook as the first series of explosions went off in the distance, followed by a second wave. The sound was deafening, and Jackson's pulse quickened. He could hear the frantic responses from the enemy troops as they scrambled to contain the damage. "Now!" Lyra's voice rang out, and within seconds, her forces launched their final assault. Jackson watched the holographic displays as Lyra's soldiers moved into the enemy's territory, exploiting the chaos caused by the explosions. The tide of battle had turned. For hours, Jackson watched as Lyra's forces, bolstered by the disarray of the enemy, pushed forward, reclaiming ground and driving Thalos's soldiers back. The battle wasn't over, but the worst of it had passed. The enemy was retreating. When the news came that Thalos's forces were withdrawing, Jackson let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had done it. They had done it. But the war wasn't over yet. They had won a battle, but there were many more to fight. Lyra stepped up beside him, her expression one of quiet triumph, but her eyes were still hard with the weight of leadership. "We've won today," she said softly, "but the war is far from over." Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of the truth in her words. "I know." But this was the first step. Lyra turned to him, her expression softening. "And you were with us every step of the way, Jackson. I couldn't have done it without you." Jackson didn't know how to respond. He was still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. He had helped save an entire kingdom. He had helped them fight for their future. He wasn't just a researcher from Earth anymore. He had become a part of something greater. "Thank you," Lyra said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You're no longer just a guest here, Jackson." "Your family," Jackson swallowed, his emotions swirling. He had never felt more out of place, but at the same time, he had never felt more at home. "I'll stay," he said finally. "I'll stay and fight for this." And as he stood by Lyra's side, looking out over the battlefield, Jackson realized that no matter where he came from, he had found a new home, a new purpose. The war was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Together, they would face it side by side.